If you're newer to the current Dungeons & Dragons landscape of self-expression, fancy miniatures, and dice hoarding, then you're liable to be somewhat confused when I say that back in the heyday, D&D, and more specifically whoever was running it, was all about worlds. That's right, back in the 80s, recently reformed comedy troupe Motley Crue were all about girls, 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 and TSR and/or Wizards were all about worlds, worlds, worlds. Now, I don't think what purpose campaign settings serve requires all that much explanation. At their core, they grant players a veritable playground to explore and forge their own adventures within for those that don't want to develop their own settings, but also a place for developers to stage pre-made modules and adventures with more detailed stories. For whatever need they fulfilled, I'm certainly not gilding the lily on just how obsessed with campaign settings D&D used to be. From 1980 until the turn of the millennium, there were a whopping 26 campaign settings either produced or licensed by the owners of D&D at the time and subsequently released to the public. Now, the overall scope of these worlds varied wildly. You had settings such as the well-known Greyhawk or Forgotten Realms that were decidedly expansive and fleshed out. Then you had more singular, sort of specifically intentioned endeavors that may have been intended for a singular purpose or niche interest. Then, long before Wizards would start to develop crossover worlds with their other successful IP, Magic the Gathering, in more recent days, you had wacky collaborations for certain materials, D&D or otherwise, such as those for Conan the Barbarian, that being Schwarzenegger's Conan, for the record, and even Diablo. Like, if you were playing Dungeons & Dragons during this time and couldn't find a game world that tickled your fancy, you probably just weren't meant to be playing D&D, if we're being real. In more recent years, however, Wizards has seemingly set themselves on taking the exact opposite approach to their settings. In a not dissimilar stretch of time, from 2000 until now, there have been 8 worlds published, and only 2 of them were initially created with Dungeons & Dragons in mind, with all the others either being one of the aforementioned crossovers or the brainchild of Matt Mercer, Exandria, which was originally a Pathfinder setting. Now that I think about it, Mr. Mercer has probably made Wizards an absurd amount of money over the past decade, both in literal published material and just general publicity. God, if the money-grubbing part of me wouldn't love to know what that number is, good God. But anyway, that means, as ironic as it might seem, that the last world that Wizards had a real hand in developing for D&D was actually Eberron, the enduring bastion of Dungeons & Dragons Online, which was first published over 20 years ago. That is a long time to effectively rest on your laurels. Yeesh. The real question to all of this is why? What was it about these worlds that spurred the ownership groups to crank out a new setting at the rate of more than 1 a year over the course of 2 decades, and then just as quickly make an about-face in recent times? Now, there really isn't a concrete answer to this. This is flatly another video where Fandrax rants about an incredibly niche D&D topic that he thought about while in the shower one day. Don't get it twisted. But I do think there are a few points that could be gleaned from both TSR and Wizards' actions over the years, as well as a few that just make logical sense. For starters, as D&D started to be developed and grew in popularity, there became an obvious need to have places for newer players to partake in the game within. As such, it seemed like TSR made a real effort to try and cover their bases with regard to the different types of settings to appeal to different types of gamers. Beyond the seminal Greyhawk, they certainly made sure they had their high fantasy, sword and sorcery themed worlds covered, with Mystara, Dragonlance, and of course the Forgotten Realms, no doubt because high fantasy, with no shortage of Tolkien worship to be found basically anywhere, is easily the type of world most commonly associated with D&D. The emergence of the Forgotten Realms meant they were pretty well and settled in that department, which left TSR and Wizards more flexibility to branch out into more specific tastes. You got the gothic threads of Ravenloft, the apocalyptic depression of Darksun, space with Spelljammer, and the general oddity and zaniness that is Planescape, just to name a few. All of these worlds, as I joked earlier, meant that TSR and Wizards had a foothold in just about every type of genre or style of fantasy and/or fiction they could possibly want. This, as you can imagine, had real practical business applications to it. It allowed TSR and Wizards to publish a tremendous amount of supplemental material in the form of individual modules, novels, and pretty much anything else that they might be able to convince people to spend money on. I mean, there were literally hundreds of modules published during this time period, some of which I've been fortunate enough to cover on this channel, and similarly, hundreds of novels, and more so in the 90s, video games across all of these worlds that made their way to players. Now, one would be forgiven for not understanding why that flatly wouldn't have been possible without all these different worlds, and it's because TSR or Wizards would have run the risk of flooding the zone to the point of oversaturation to their own detriment. Having all these worlds meant that they had ample fields in which to sow their wild oats without much fear of anything becoming bogged down within itself or stale. Like, you almost have to regard these worlds as cuisines in cooking. A lot of types of cooking use the same ingredients, just as these worlds share many aspects amongst one another, the most obvious being the game they're attached to. But different cuisines use different ingredients in very different ways, much in the manner that these D&D worlds are able to provide entertainment with their own unique flavor. I'm hungry now. I do think the pinnacle of this being able to crank out as much content as they wanted without fear of getting lost in themselves is best seen in the novels, starting with Cragkeep by the indomitable Andre Norton, which I really want to get my hands on at some point. TSR and Wizards absolutely cranked out novels, and for good reason, because they were an absolute cash cow for them. And I mean, you're just gonna have to head over to the wiki page for published D&D fiction yourself and scroll for eons, because I couldn't even try to tell you how many works associated with Dungeons & Dragons and these worlds were actually sent to consumers in the 20 years in question. This, of course, is where players were introduced to authors such as Ed Greenwood, Margaret Weiss, Tracy Hickman, R.A. Salvatore, and God knows how many others, along with their iconic characters such as Elminster, the Heroes of the Lance, and Drizzt. Writers started working together on anthologies and the sort, and before long you had such a mess of material that I don't even think you could try to make sense of it all, even if you wanted to. By the same token, it didn't really matter that you couldn't, because with the way that a lot of the stories, especially those that morphed into long runners, were contained within their own worlds, or at the very least their own place within those worlds, they were able to be enjoyed on their own. They were secular to themselves in the best way possible. Amazingly, TSR and Wizards had managed to do what a company like Disney has failed to get straight with something like their Marvel IPs in more recent days, which is produce more content than any one person can handle, but do so in a way that means each piece is basically enjoyable and understandable on its own. You certainly didn't need to have read the Elminster novels to enjoy the Drizzt works, for instance. And to shift gears, I think just how much the books themselves actually use these worlds is probably part of the reason why you don't see as many of them being created now. As sad as it is to a nerd like myself, books, and by that I mean fiction novels and whatnot, rule and source books are still huge for Wizards, obviously, aren't that big a part of the current business model of D&D. On that same wiki page I mentioned from earlier, the difference between the size of the list for what was released in the 80s and 90s compared to the 2000s, really the 2010s and onward, is staggering. Honestly, at this point, it seems like the only novels really being written are whatever Salvatore is still somehow doing with Drizzt, whether it's actually him writing it or not. You guys can just give that character a break, by the way. Bro has to be exhausted. Maybe there's an argument for contracting more writers, because ironically, all those releases in the 80s and 90s, as you can imagine, did quite the job in fostering and develop fans of these worlds, and within the current way D&D is structured, there just doesn't seem to be enough bandwidth for Wizards to get around to all of them. I mean, it's well documented at this point that Greyhawk has seen a pretty steep decline in popularity and more pressingly in official support in the last 20 years or so, and it was only recently that worlds like Ravenloft and Dragonlance have made a comeback. I mean, in the past, the designers have literally admitted to tabling things until they find the time to get around them. Because of the current landscape and business model of D&D, there are actually now too many settings for Wizards to get around to. I also think there's an aspect of the fact that with almost 40 years to have spent with a lot of these worlds, that players have just come to like what they like. The Forgotten Realms, namely. Yeah, as if I'm breaking news here, the Forgotten Realms has become so popular within the game that it's basically synonymous with it at this point. Now, there is another video to be made about how specifically the Forgotten Realms became king in the world of D&D, but I would have to imagine that Wizards eventually reached the point where, because of the popularity of something like the Forgotten Realms, that they decided they didn't need to make any new worlds, and as I'm sure that ghoulish company is more concerned with, that doing so would actually only bring diminishing returns to their bottom line. As such, they've chosen to leave the maintenance of these older universes to the fans themselves, which isn't a horrible thing, mind you, but some official support would be nice. Additionally, I think with the proliferation of online actual play games and whatnot, that players are more willing and eager to develop their own settings. Not that they didn't do that in the olden days, of course, but just that such interest is greater today than might have been in the past. As the worlds have become more cemented and the interests of those playing D&D has changed, there hasn't been as much need to develop worlds for the general public as there was in the past. If there's anything I would like to see in the future, it might be something of a return to the older format. Like, start writing books again, man. It's okay to publish content that isn't specifically used for actually playing the game. D&D, in my opinion, needs to get back to the days when it had heroes and legends, characters that you wanted your own to stand next to in terms of strength and personality. They've got ample settings and worlds to choose from. There isn't a market that they can't appeal to at this point. All that needs to be done is to actually put in the work. Maybe we won't be seeing new worlds anytime soon. I would bet on that, actually. I think most of what we're going to get is going to be more crossovers, but that doesn't mean the game wouldn't be made better by stronger usage of the ones we have.